All right, so the conversation is now live, and I'm very, very, very glad to have Leo Burtscher join me for this conversation that we're going to have. Hi, Brent. Good to see you. At least we have one listener who has an interest in the subject. And Brent, just so that you know, this is a social audio experience. So, if you want to join in on the conversation at any point, what you can do is just raise your hand, and we can come up and have a discussion with us from on what they call the stage. So just a little bit of background about myself. I head up a consultancy called Future Work IQ, and what we basically do is spend our time helping leadership teams to get their heads around the future of work and then to prepare for it. At the moment, we are spending a considerable amount of our time in talking to leadership teams about climate literacy, because we know that as a result of the situation we're facing at the moment, there are basically two tasks that all companies and leadership teams have. One is you got to think about mitigation and what you can do to decouple from fossil fuels. That's the one half of the conversation. And then the other half is adaptation, right? How do we change the way we work? And today's conversation that we're going to be having is all about how events and the event industry and all those things can adapt in the face of the climate crisis. And Leo, just maybe a comment from you. Where are you joining us from today, and a little bit about your background before we get off with this interesting conversation?
Well, thanks a lot for the introduction, Peter, and hello everyone. So I'm joining from close to Munich actually at the moment, although my position is still in Leiden, but I'm holding this remotely since quite a time. And yeah, I mean we're seeing the impacts of the climate crisis everywhere. I mean these days it has been extremely hot in the Netherlands, more than 40 degrees, which is very unusual for that place. And in Germany, we're seeing a drought wave that hadn't been here before either. I mean, the Rhine River is so as low as never recorded. Shipping is almost stopping. So, and of course, there's wildfires everywhere in Europe, even also in Germany. So people are realizing that the climate crisis is not something that is in the far distance and not only affecting the polar bears, but really it's with us, and we need to see how to fix it.
Leo, so maybe it's a good idea for us to get into the conversation. I just want to say to Lisa and Sandra that have joined us, this is a social audio experience. So if you want to join the conversation, just raise your hand, and I'll invite you up, and we can have your comments. So, Leo, you were the lead author of a paper entitled "The Carbon Footprint of Large Astronomy Meetings." Now, I know you are an astronomer, and obviously that's the sort of context that you came to with this paper that you did. It was done in the latter half of 2020, right? If I'm not mistaken.
And that's correct. Yes. Well, no. Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
It was so the original event that it was based on was in 2019. That's why I was
The,
struggling for a moment. Um, but yeah, indeed. So this paper was an attempt to compare the carbon emissions from a large astronomy meeting as we used to have it. Some people call it now a legacy meeting, which of course has a certain framing, like the one we had in 2019 with 1,500 people or so coming to Lyon, France, to discuss astronomy from a European perspective, the so-called European Astronomical Society annual meeting. And then after the Corona pandemic hit in 2020, the same meeting was held online, and that gave us the chance to compare these two meetings in a number of aspects, but in particular also the carbon footprint. And yeah, so that was the goal of the paper.
all right. But of course the principles behind what you guys actually ended up finding with the research applies to all meetings, really. I mean, yes, this had an astronomy focus, and you were comparing one astronomy meeting that was event that was in person compared to one that was online. We understand that. Can I just ask you, high level, do you recall what was the difference in emissions between the two?
Yeah, that was really, to me, actually the most surprising result of that paper, and that certainly helped that it was well, we had good editors as well to frame this in the proper way. The difference in emissions was huge. The carbon emissions for the online meeting was less than a factor of 3,000
Wow.
more than the online meeting. So this is really an immense factor, and I think that, and it's quite consistent with. I mean, of course, we were not the only ones who did this, right? Many people compared these emissions. There was others who did this for other scientific meetings, and as you said, of course, also for other non-scientific meetings, because in the end, the air travel there is not specific to scientific meetings, and it's always this factor of between 1,000 and a few thousand that has been found. So that, yeah, that was the main result, so to say.
So I mean, if you think about this, I mean, the two events, if they roughly about the online event was roughly 3,000 times smaller than the face-to-face ones, this should give all event organizers a pause to really think about the emissions that are associated with an event, right?
I think so, yes. And actually, I mean, uh, this is absolutely true. I think everyone should at least be aware of these gigantic emissions that all these meetings have. I mean, all scientific meetings, as a colleague of mine has neatly said, put together have the emissions of a small country, namely that of Iceland. I mean, it is admittedly a very small country, but nevertheless, it is not nothing, right? This is really the whole event business, and this is just the scientific event business, is as much as the carbon footprint of an entire nation. So this is certainly something one has to take into account when organizing a meeting. But there is another aspect that is perhaps even more important and being realized now by more and more people in the scientific discipline. But again, I'm sure this also affects other meetings just as well. Namely that we are not just saving emissions, we're also opening up the meeting to people who would normally never join an in-person meeting because it's just too expensive, too much time commitment, or otherwise there are too many hurdles to go there.
Well, I mean, that is absolutely correct. I mean, you know, in the past, the way things used to work was if you wanted to attend a meeting of any sort, an event of any sort, you basically had to, you know, get in a car and drive there, or you had to get in an aeroplane and fly there. And to many people, that was obviously extremely restrictive. So, again, like you've just said, there's this co-benefit that often comes with us doing things differently, especially when we start looking at emissions. Now, I must tell you, Leo, that for me, and maybe you can just elaborate a little bit maybe on what you think of this as well. But for me, when we speak to leadership teams, what we basically the basic message that we're giving them is, look, what's going to happen as we progress during this climate crisis is that the need for us to decouple from fossil fuels as much as possible with virtually everything that we do is going to rise exponentially. Whether that be because we need to do the right thing, it's the moral thing to do, or whether there is actually legislation, it doesn't matter. Both those things, the pressure to decouple and to do things differently is going to rise exponentially. So what the pandemic has basically taught us, one of the lessons it gave us, there's really two that I just want to mention. The first is how unprepared people were for the pandemic or something like that. And it tested business continuity plans to the limit. And many businesses failed that completely and then were thrust into an environment where they had to rush to actually learn to do things differently, to work differently. Now, every industry faced that. Now, if we look at this at the point we are now, we need to start thinking about, what is going to happen with the climate crisis? How is it going to progress? And how can we start doing things differently now so that we're not, again, caught off guard by regulation or events like extreme weather events that basically cancel events because they can't happen or people can't get to them. It's important to start thinking about that now. Would you agree with that sort of general view around this topic?
Oh, definitely. We should definitely prepare for what's coming. I think we haven't prepared well enough for a very long time. Let me just briefly say hi to Tanya, who has just joined. And for those who don't know her, Tanya is also working at the university in Leiden, where I work. And Tanya is actually the reason why we're here today, because it was an event that she organized before the pandemic, already in a hybrid way, really kind of a precursor, really with all the experimentation in mind to see how that works. And Peter joined from South Africa. I joined at that time from Leiden. And that's where we met, right, Peter? And since then, we've been in touch. So that shows you the potential of networking in the purely online world. We've never met in person, Peter, right? So to me, this is a very interesting aspect. Hi,
Yeah,
Tanya.
yeah, absolutely. And Tanya, it's good to see you here. As for those who are joining the conversation, if you want to come up, just raise your hand. There's a little button where you can do so, and then we can bring you up onto the stage, and you can share with us your views on this. And Leo's quite right. I was going to say this in the introduction when we spoke that we actually met at an online event. I don't think you were in the live event on that day, were you, Leo? I don't think so. You were also joining virtually.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't either. No, I was
Yeah.
physically probably 5 kilometers from Tanya and the rest, but I was also there online. Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
and that really, with Tanya's doing at Leiden, we this experiment or this concept of actually being able to do things differently is massive. So I want to ask you something, Leo, just to open up the conversation completely. If you considering this paper, and by the way, what I'm going to do for those of you that haven't seen this paper, it's entitled "The Carbon Footprint of Large Astronomy Meetings." I will share the link afterwards on my profile on LinkedIn, and you can just click through to that if you want to read this paper. But as you said, you weren't the only ones that actually compared the footprint of meetings, etc. But now, if you looking forward to the future, given what we're going to have to do around emissions, etc., what do you think we should be considering when we're thinking about hosting corporate events or any event really where it involves bringing people into a physical setting?
I think whenever you organize a meeting, the most important aspect that I learned actually also as part of the whole online meeting world is to ask yourself, why am I holding this meeting? And surprisingly, this question is often not asked at the beginning of many meetings. People just say, oh, we just organized the meeting because, well, we always organize that meeting, right? We just come together once a year to talk, to meet each other. Yeah? But I think you need to be more careful in thinking about, why do I really need this meeting? Is it mostly for information sharing? Do you want to share the most recent results or whatever business figures and then discuss about that? Then you really don't need to meet in person. Then this is just as easily done online. It's much cheaper, much more efficient, mostly for people who don't have time. They don't have to travel all that distance. It's much more inclusive. You can, the young mother, the young father who are at home caring for their kids can also join, and if they have an hour or so for that. So that's one aspect. But then, of course, for many meetings, you have this aspect of networking. I want to have this social aspect, the human factor, and that I think is where most transformation will lie in the next few years to come, where we need to find ways to somehow model this into the online world. And that is not yet perfect, although there's a number of wonderful tools around, from Gather Town to Wonder Me, and of course virtual reality platforms. There's so many things that you can use, but it doesn't yet have the feeling of sitting together with someone at a nice table drinking a glass of wine. So it's just different. And I think this is the aspect that we need to focus on in the future to see, to shape the future of these meetings.
Which leads me to ask you just another question, Leo. I know that you are also involved with a group. I think they call themselves the Future of Meetings. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, and definitely a huge shout out to them. I mean, this group has been organized or is being organized by Vanessa Moss, who is also an astronomer and was also in the Netherlands. So this is really the place where many things are happening. And she's become, again, also a very good friend of mine, but I've never met her in person. She's now back in Australia. And this group that she's organizing, as you said, the Future of Meetings, they organized a symposium at the end of 2019. No, sorry, at the end of 2020, but it was planned before the pandemic already. So there was really a pre-pandemic thought that happened in the beginning of the pandemic somehow. And they are asking exactly these questions. So how do we need to meet in the future? What is the purpose of a meeting and how do you best fulfill it? They have a couple of really nice papers and overviews with lots of good resources and also a very nice webpage. I can share it to your overview that you want to put in your website later, Peter.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I wanted to just ask you, Leo, when you did this paper, when you looked at in-person meetings, where was the biggest emissions coming from with in-person meetings?
Well, to be honest, we only looked at a particular aspect, namely the emissions from travel.
Okay.
And that was mostly because these were the numbers that were most readily available to us, but also because we're all physicists, so we're doing these order of magnitude estimates, and we estimated, okay, what is the energy consumption at the site, for using the lights, for using the laptops, for using the projectors. What is we didn't have air conditioning at that meeting, so that was zero emissions. We did have food, of course, that's also a component that can also be factored in. Other people, other studies, who studied, for example, the carbon footprint of institutes, have done that, and they typically found that these emissions, these very local emissions, are really only a minor factor and totally outweighed by the emissions from transport. And that's just because a single flight, even within Europe, is already something like 500 kilograms of CO2. Now, unless you eat 3 beefsteaks every day, you can hardly weigh that up with food or also actually with anything else. So that is really the reason why we focused on transport emissions, and also because that is the hardest part to work on, right? I mean, for food, yes, we have alternatives. For electricity, well, we can use green electricity. That's something that needs to happen more quickly, but we know how to do it in principle. For air conditioning or even for heating in the winter, well, we can use heat pumps. Air conditioning uses electricity anyway. So all these aspects already have green sustainable solutions. They just need to be implemented. For the air travel, there is no sustainable alternative at the moment. Of course, within Europe, you can travel by train. But another interesting result from the study was that half the emissions of the conference came from about 10% of the people, namely those who traveled intercontinentally. So if all the Europeans took the train for the next meeting, and that would be quite a challenge for people coming from places like Moscow or Tel Aviv, okay, perhaps not quite Europe, but still, the border of Europe, then that would only lower the carbon footprint by a factor of 2. But we need to get to 0, of course, within the next 10 or 15 years. So that was kind of the reason why we focused on these transport emissions.
Okay, so which leads me to another question. I know with yourself, you have been using the train a lot more in getting from where you are, for example, to Leiden. I know I saw you, followed you doing something like that. Would you say that is something that's generally beginning to become an awareness in Europe in general, or what is your feeling?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the night trains in Europe are really skyrocketing. It's very hard to get a ticket on a night train if you want to travel even a few weeks from now. So they are being extremely popular. The train system in Germany, as you may know, we had this activity called, or this action called €9 ticket, where you were allowed to travel on any public transport except the highest speed trains or the long distance trains for €9 for an entire month. And that was a huge success. 99% of everyone in Germany knows that, and many people have used it. So that is definitely coming more and more in Europe. But again, it's only a solution for
we've lost Leo there for a second.
To, oh, sorry.
No, no, go ahead, Leo.
So we need, just saying, if you want to be a global community, then you need to connect this global community, and for that, there is no train to the US or to Australia or even to South Africa where you are. So for that, we need to find online means.
Online solutions. So I've just Sandra asked to come up onto stage here. Sandra, so I know I've been interacting with you in comments on on LinkedIn, so it's really great to actually get to meet you like this and hear your voice. So over to you. What observation or questions do you have, Sandra?
So, first off, I'd like to say thank you for having this conversation. I find this topic really fascinating because it certainly opens up the platform, or just kind of the platform in general, around different alternatives for how we think about how we meet, how we interact, the events, that kind of stuff. So again, thank you to both of you for having this conversation. My question is specifically around all the things, Leonard, that you talked about in terms of the advantages of how much of the was it the greenhouse gas emissions and stuff comes from, like, the travel, when you're coordinating these events and these sort of in-person things, the fact that there's the social element, and kind of all the reasons that companies or organizations that are planning for events sort of say they need it for the social aspect, the networking, that kind of thing. I guess what's interesting to me is I've seen in the last little while documents that have surfaced around the greenhouse gas emissions, or kind of the impact on the environment as it relates to the data centers. So as we push more and more activity online, obviously there's more people participating online on events that if you were to go in person, obviously it would be limited, both because of the restrictions around budget, restrictions around travel, just kind of all of those things. So I'm just curious to hear, like, is that actually true? Like, are you seeing or hearing anything in that regard in terms of what is the impact to the environment from purely from a data perspective as it relates to data centers and pushing everything more so to this online environment that we all have at our fingertips, and what potentially might be the impact of the environment from that perspective?
Hmm. Yeah, hi Sandra. That's a very good question, and one that we actually got a number of times in the reactions to this article, because it has been so much in the media that all the online events are taking up so much energy, and that is true. I mean, compared to, I don't know, 50 years ago, where people would perhaps grab a book or a magazine and then sit in their armchair and read it in the evening. Now everyone watches HD TV on Netflix with 4K or whatever, and everyone is constantly online on their iPhone and iPad and Android and whatever, all at the same time. That is taking a huge amount of energy. That is absolutely true. But if you compare the incremental emissions of connecting online for a while, let's say for a week. I mean, we did this, and I'm very happy to share this paper, and also or send directly the PDF if you want. We did this for the specific use case of being online for 5 hours a day, for 5 days a week, in Zoom, so with video on. That takes about 1.2 megabit per second. And if you then calculate how much network traffic that is, and how much CO2 emissions that corresponds to, it's surprisingly little. So our calculation was 300 kilograms of CO2 for all participants, for all nearly 1,800 participants who were online the year after this, after the 2019 meeting, so for the 2020 online meeting. And that is because of two things. Online meetings actually don't need a lot of network bandwidth, right? I mean, a Zoom meeting is not the same as watching the latest blockbuster in 4K. And transporting data over the internet has become more and more efficient all the time. So the number that we quote here is that it takes about, I'm not sure how technical this should be, but the number that we found for energy consumption for transporting data over the internet is 0.06 kilowatt hours per gigabyte. And I mean, that's really almost nothing, right? 0.06 kilowatt hours, that's like charging your phone. And that's for transporting an entire gigabyte of data which gets you a very long way if you're communicating via Zoom. And then you can, of course, convert these kilowatt hours again into CO2 emissions, which, of course, depends on your local,
Right.
the carbon intensity of your network. But long story short, the total amount of emissions from network activity is considerable. But the question, if you say, okay, I want to either have a Zoom meeting or fly to the US to meet people, then it's very, very clear to see the difference in emissions towards or beneficial to the online meeting. As I said before, I'm not sure if you were online at the time, there's about a factor 3,000 difference whether you fly there or whether you join a 1 week meeting online.
Yeah, that totally. I mean, that's what I was hoping you were going to say. So, I totally agree with that.
You're
But
welcome.
here's another angle too that you also hear as well is the fact that people are now distributed and working from home. The impact. So when you think about again greenhouse gas emissions, responsibility from the company's organization's perspective in terms of setting their targets to get to net zero and whatever it is that they're going to be contributing to to it in the long term, with people now being at home, being online. Okay, the activity that's happening online is one thing, but then where do you stop in terms of the measurement? Like if people are at home, you've got the heating costs and electricity costs and all the things that relate to the fact that before everybody was in a building or went to a location for an event, they were under one roof, and you basically whatever it cost to basically run that event or to run the office, you kind of knew what it was. Now you've got this distribution of people both in the office, in working from home. That certainly must have an impact as well on the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions as it relates to events as well. Because if you got people at home, is it just the event? Because similar to the travel and all the other considerations that lead to that in terms of what are the savings and kind of what is the impact, I would imagine there probably would be similar considerations for it's not just about being online, but the location aspect as well in terms of where are you logging in from and how different is that if everybody was in one location versus being in multiple locations.
Yeah, so on the last point, if you have a local online meeting, then clients like Zoom, for example, choose actually local data centers where they route most of the traffic through. So if you have a meeting only in North America, then they will use the service in North America. So the data, of course, doesn't have to go via Europe and vice versa. So there is some benefit even of having local online meetings, so to say. But in terms of all the other emissions that you mentioned of being at home and having whatever your heating on or your network router on and all these things, that is true. I mean, these are all emissions that could be attributed to the meeting. But we didn't go into that level of detail in this paper, I have to say, because as I said before, I mean, for us, we really wanted to identify the major component of emissions, and we did a rough estimate for the others. And for that one in particular, we said that the emissions of, for example, having a network router online happen anyway, right? Whether you're at the meeting, I mean, everyone at these meetings is typically sitting there, whether it's online or not, with their laptop and reading email. So you need a network router there anyway. And if you have it at home, it typically is connected even if you're not at home. I mean, your partner or kids might be at home, or you might just not turn it off at the time. So I don't think you're really saving emissions by getting people out of their homes into some conference center, but you're just adding extra emissions. And the major part of these extra emissions is the travel related emissions.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that.
And
Thank you for joining, Sandra.
Sandra, just to mention to you, and I suppose Leo, you could give your thoughts on this. The other thing that's also beginning to happen is that the companies that are, whose data centers these are, like for example Google or Facebook or these larger companies, many of them, these data centers are beginning to run on renewable energy, which will also obviously have an impact on what happens with regards to meetings and the data that's used that moves through those data centers. To give an example, Apple in their 2021 sustainability report, they were actually beginning to look at not only their personal, usage at their headquarters in California, but they were also beginning to get their manufacturing partners to commit to this. But the next thing they were doing is they were saying, and this I suppose speaks to your point about, what happens to emissions that people create when they're at home. But in the case of Apple, what they were starting to do is they say, well, look, our customers actually charge their devices. And so what we need to do is we want to be responsible or show our responsibility towards trying to bring those emissions down. And so in Apple's case, what they've done is they've invested in a massive solar farm in Texas, and another one in Australia that they've just gone to. So, I think what's going to happen is as the grid becomes cleaner, and as we start using renewable energy for our basic energy needs, what's going to happen is then the transport piece of this puzzle is the one that's going to sit right at the top, because you can basically almost electrify everything up until the airport. You can electrify the airport as well, but the actual flight is going to be where the emissions are then going to come from. So Brent,
that's
sorry,
Sorry, Peter. Just say that this is absolutely spot on. I mean, that's exactly the point. Just to add another number to this, because we did these carbon assessments also for not just for the institute for the travel, but also actually for all Dutch institutes in last year in another paper. And there we found that just looked it up, the fraction of air travel as all of emissions in Dutch astronomy research was 42%. And wow. Before the paper was published, one institute that we had included in our analysis said, okay, we actually just switched to green energy, which meant that this number has gone up a couple of percentage points. So like you say, I mean, everything can be electrified except air travel, at least at the moment, and also for the coming years.
Right. Great. So Brent, thanks for raising your hand there. We're really interested to hear your comment, observation, or question. Go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Leo, as well. Very insightful. I'm looking forward to reading the paper. I have not yet, but I was wondering if we could also talk about, or I'm curious with regards to flexibility and frequency. So you think of large events, say the Consumers Electronics Show was held annually, but I have to suspect, and there's a certain momentum about that, right? Is that it's multiple days in Las Vegas or so on. Do you find, or have you looked at the advantage of saying, oh, we don't need to have a 3-day conference, we can have multiple 1-hour conferences or 1-hour get-togethers more often? And if that is an advantage to a lot of organizations as well and individuals.
Yeah, should I take this? There's indeed lots of opportunities to invent new formats. I mean, the online world, I've seen, almost anything that you can think of come up, and I agree. I mean, why have a 3-day meeting and force everyone to cut out 3 days of their busy schedules at a particular time where it might just not be very well suiting? And instead, if you can have this as, I don't know, a weekly 1-hour meeting, it's much more likely that someone can join at least at some point. I've seen a colleague of mine who said, okay, actually, we don't need the meeting, being online synchronously, everyone at the same time at all. He created the website exoplanet-talks.org. So this is for, again, an astronomy topic, search for extraterrestrial planets outside our solar system. And for that community, my colleague created this web repository where everyone who publishes a paper on that topic can record a short talk, 5 to 10 minutes, and then put it online. And then you have essentially like a repository of colloquium or very short, let's say more like lunch talks, short talks, to get a quick introduction to that paper. And if you have a question, you just ask it on that website, and the author can reply whenever they have time. So that's a wonderful tool of using online that you could never do in a real life setting. So yeah, there's so many options that you can experiment with. And again, that's coming back to the group that Peter mentioned before, Vanessa Moss and others in Australia, the future of meetings, who say, this is very new somehow. We've only been starting to experiment with this since Corona, really. we just need to keep experimenting and evaluating and just see what works best. This is different for every use case. This is different for every community. So just try it out, and no restrictions. Everything's possible online.
I have another question. Just as we were talking about the air travel, because obviously that's a huge factor in business and events. Kind of everything we do. Obviously, if you're traveling by air, there's a ton of carbon emissions that are happening as a result of that. What I find interesting, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, is the whole concept of carbon credits and carbon offsets, and how that basically has created almost like a level of permissiveness, if you will. And how does that play into kind of the future? Is that something that's going to stay, or is that something that needs to go away in order for us to fix the issue?
Oh, I'm not sure, Peter, if you want to answer, but I have a very clear opinion on that.
No, please go ahead, Leo. We value your insights because you got some good background on this.
Oh well, come on, everyone has their own insights, but I think carbon offsets are not helping in the transformation to sustainable business. Not at all. They might even be counterproductive, and the reason is that there isn't enough space to plant enough trees to really offset all the emissions that we have. And of course, there's other tools as well. There's carbon farming and all these things. The problem is we're at a point, having ignored climate science for decades, even centuries. Some people say, people have come up with the idea in the 1850s, that at the moment it's no longer a question of should I do this or should I do that to fix the climate crisis. No, we need to do everything. Yes, we need to plant trees, of course, especially in cities. We need to have more green, just so that people can continue living even in a heat wave. But that doesn't mean that you can take a plane, as to buy off your emissions. We just need to do both, and we should absolutely get to zero emissions, not some net zero or whatever it's called, that balances out various ways. It's very risky to do this. There is no scientific evidence that it actually works. You can go to the literature. There's no paper that actually says, okay, this really works. There's also an issue with timescales. If I take a flight to the US now, from Europe and back, this is about 2 tons of emissions. And if I then plant a tree, the emissions are there immediately. The tree will need 40 years or so until it has sucked up these emissions again. So for 40 years, these emissions will be in the air and they will heat the atmosphere. And we really need to reduce the emissions now and not sometime in the future. So there's all sorts of problems. And then, of course, in the warming and more dry, more extreme climate, we have the problem that forests that might have been started as a compensation forest may just burn down. As we have seen, there was actually one story in the news a couple of weeks ago of a particular forest, I think somewhere in the US, that was built up by a company as, from all these offsets that just completely burnt down. And then there go your emission offsets, right? So this is not at all. We should do these things, but not as a kind of make good for the flights, but we should do both, right? Reduce the flights and build or grow more trees.
So Leo, Sandra, I want to just make a comment on this, and then I want to go back to Brent. So I agree with you 100%. To me, this whole thing about carbon offsets, etc., is like an accounting exercise that tries to get people off the hook about doing what they need to do, which is to stop burning fossil fuels, period. That's what has to happen. And these comments that you made about how long it takes for trees that are planted, for example, to actually even begin to do the job that they're meant to do with drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, it's really not viable. We are putting more carbon into the atmosphere than could possibly be removed at the speed that we need it to. So in essence, we really just need to stop with emissions. That's really the bottom line. Brent, I want to come back to your question, and then I want to ask Leo what his thoughts are on this as well. So what I noticed during events that we did during COVID, what we were doing is, there's this traditional story of everybody is synchronous for the event. In other words, you arrive and you have to be there to listen to the keynote, etc. But what we started doing is we actually started uploading the keynotes and the presentations prior to the event. And then what we did is we used the event, the time allotted for each of these topics to actually discuss the pre-recorded material. And what we found is that the interactivity, we found that the way people were interacting with the content changed dramatically. Now that's something that wasn't possible before. I mean, if you sat in an audience, you listened to a talk, maybe afterwards, if there was a little bit of a Q&A session, and if it was the audience size wasn't that big, maybe you get to ask your question about something. But the majority of the time was actually taken up by the keynote, and you just sat there listening. Now, with online events, what you can very easily do is you can just turn that whole thing up on its head, and make the actual presentation part of this asynchronous. And then what you can do is you can have people actually come in for a conversation around the topic, and it's a lot more viable. You've had some experience with that, Leo, right?
A little bit, but mostly actually as participant in such conferences. For the conferences that I organized myself, we have discussed this concept that, as far as I know, was first proposed by a researcher in California, Ken Rice, or so I believe. It was called an NCN, Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference, already many years back. And I like the idea, especially because it helps to overcome the fact that the world is, despite other claims, round and not flat. So we have time zones. And for that, of course, it's very good to limit the amount of time that needs to be spent in a synchronous way. But what I have seen and also heard from many other people, that surprisingly, many people, even those who like online communication, find it difficult to, to muster the enthusiasm, perhaps, to join a recorded talk or to listen to the recorded talks before some live discussion session. And I think the reason is that we still need to adapt to this new world, so to say, to this online world, where we have to realize that, you're not just at a conference when you're physically somewhere, but you can also be at a conference at various places or at various points in time. And then you just have to somehow tell your colleagues, no, don't interrupt me now. I'm part of conference now for the next 1 hour, so to say. But that seems to be very hard. And with our, everyone's always available culture, it seems more difficult to join something that is recorded where everyone says, oh, you can just watch it later or press the pause button. But if you say, I'm at this conversation now, then everyone seems to accept that. And also people are more motivated to actually join it. So I think it's a very powerful idea. I really want to see it happen more. And I think it has certainly not seen the end of experimentation. But for the meetings that I've been at, they have mostly been synchronously online. And then we recorded the talks and put them to some playback site later. But this pre-record and then watch is not yet, at least in astronomy, it's not yet the norm, so to say.
Great. Thanks, Leo, for that observation. Brent, any further comments from you about this?
No, I appreciate the insight. I agree. We talk about inside the company and place being a question mark. We challenge the assumptions there. And I appreciate you challenging the assumptions when it comes to outside or intra organization or activities like events. So it's good insight. Thank you.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Brent. Tanya, do you want to come up and give us your insights of stuff that you have learned over this last while? Let me bring Tanya up. Hi, Tanya, you there? If you just want to try that again, maybe.
She's not up yet, as far as I can see.
Yeah, she's not. She did raise her hand, and I did allow her in. But maybe if you could just try again, Tanya, that will be great. So, if Tanya can get up, then what we will do is if she can't get up, oh, there we go. Tanya's with us. Hi, Tanya. You can just unmute. There we
I
go.
think I'm
We can hear you. Go ahead.
right.
Hey, Tanya. Hello.
I don't seem to be hearing anybody else.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I'm wondering if I can message Tanya here quickly. Let me just try that. Hopefully she sees that.
Okay, I get a message from Peter that you can hear me, but I can't hear the rest of you. So one of the reasons I raised my hand was because one of the things that interests me is the future. Obviously, I work for the Center of Innovation, but the immediate future. And one of the things that are coming up is Web 3.0, which doesn't just mean metaverse and big scary virtual reality, but a better integration of all the platforms. But that's also going to mean more energy intensive. And that means that we need to have a very close look at how much energy we are using with our online habits. So I wondered, Leo, if you've already looked at that, or if that's in the scope of things that we are discussing. But how about the upcoming energy use of new applications?
That's an interesting question. With new applications, you mean things like virtual reality headsets and or augmented reality and these kinds of new technology? Is that? Oh, I guess you can't hear me. Okay, I'll just assume it's that perhaps. Or, so, I mean, talking quickly about virtual reality because this is really cool. Not sure how many of you who are currently still listening have had experience with this. I joined the first such meeting in virtual reality, again with this Australian group of Vanessa Moss, the Future of Meetings, and I mean the technology is far from being perfect, and this huge virtual reality headset on your nose can also be quite a burden after, let's say, an hour or so at least. But it's really quite eye-opening to see what can be done with technology. I mean, what I had in mind, so these virtual reality meetings, you're sitting there as an avatar, and you join some group in some setting that is of course not real. Could be, I don't know, a campfire on some remote island, and that was exactly what they actually chose for their meeting. And the funny thing is that when I think back of that meeting, I remember sitting at this campfire, although of course I was sitting in my home office. And that's very different to the Zoom meetings, or possibly also this LinkedIn audio call, where you don't really remember the setting because it was just, you were just sitting in your home office and talking against the screen. So in that respect, these things are really cool. Regarding energy use, as Tanya was asking, I don't have the numbers in my head. I know that virtual reality meetings are more data intensive than a Zoom meeting. So you do need to have probably a couple megabit per second connection line rather than just 1 megabit per second with Zoom. The device itself will also use more energy than, well, actually, I'm not sure if it really uses more energy than your laptop. That I'm not sure, but let's say this is perhaps comparable. The network-related emissions will be a little bit higher, but as you said before, I mean, the whole online emissions are so much lower than in-person meetings. If we can just avoid a few more in-person meetings by being online in some sort of virtual reality setting, then this will pay off many times in terms of carbon emissions.
Thank you, Leo. And I want to say thank you for your time and for everybody that's tuned into this conversation. Thank you, Tanya, for your question. It's a pity you couldn't hear us up on stage. And so I just, from my side, I just want to say that we are going to attempt to have regular conversations around climate literacy and the impact that has on the way we start thinking about the way we do things, okay? This conversation was really like exactly that, because once you are climate literate, in other words, you almost can put on a pair of magical glasses and see what is creating emissions around you, you can begin to make different choices. And in this case, you know, Leo and the other authors that were involved in this particular paper, they really zoned in on a live astronomy meeting and an online one, and they saw that the difference between the two was about 3,000 times in emissions, which is astronomical, really. Excuse the pun there, Leo. But
You're right.
we are moving into this space where climate literacy is something that everybody's going to have or need to have, almost like digital literacy. And these conversations are part of just pushing that conversation forward. Any concluding comments from you, Leo, before we let you go to spend time with your family?
Well, I think we've touched upon very many points. Let me first just say that, I agree that climate literacy is a very good, again, I always think in terms of framing of, you know, how do you put this conversation, because that shapes how people think about things. And I think it's indeed very important to become aware of what does this climate crisis mean. And I can only say for myself, I've only been really aware of what this all means. Not all, but you know, at least the larger part of it, hopefully, since about 3 years. And this is, I find this quite shocking, because I'm a scientist. I should know about these things. I should have known about these things 10 years ago. I did know about them, but I did not know how urgent and how extreme the risk actually is that we're really ruining this only planet that we have for generations to come. So yeah, I think it's a very good framing. It's a very good series that you're starting here, Peter. I look forward to joining future ones as listener and learner. And thanks a lot for having me here. And thanks a lot to everyone for listening and asking questions.
Thank you, Leo, and thanks, Brent and Sandra, for popping up, and Tanya as well. We really appreciate your interaction. This is what social audio is all about. And have a good day or good evening wherever you are, and we'll chat soon. Go well.